The first reference appeared in a ledger so ordinary it almost dissolved into the surrounding entries. Sewer expansion along the Liffey, brick orders, labor schedules, a penciled notation about stone, encountered, below street, level, written in the same hand that recorded pipe diameters and wagon deliveries. Nothing about it was marked urgent, nothing underlined. Yet the depth recorded beside that line did not fit the city above it. Victorian engineers did not excavate blindly. They worked from surveys, from load calculations, from known river strata. The figures in the margin exceeded those norms by several feet. Then more entries followed, scattered across weeks rather than days. Measurements, tool requests, requests for additional lighting underground, a brief reference to a footing already present, described without explanation as though its existence required none. The clerks remain only as signatures, initials at the bottoms of pages. Inspectors appear through stamps and dates. Administrators surface in routing codes that redirected reports upward, then nowhere at all. The paper trail simply thins. One paragraph ends mid-sentence. The next page moves on to unrelated contracts. There is no declaration of discovery, no formal inquiry, only silence, where continuity should be, and stone, where soft river soil should have been waiting. I began tracing the official bridge program outward from that ledger entry, expecting to find its counterpart somewhere in the city's capital works. Parliamentary budgets from the early 1860s still survive in careful columns, timber allotments, iron orders, contractor retainers, each river crossing approved by committee resolution, each foundation depth listed to the foot. None of them matched what lay beneath the streets. Procurement ledgers repeated the same dimensions again and again, conservative figures aligned with the load-bearing practices of the period. Committee minutes discussed traffic flow and toll placement, not deep excavation or pre-existing stone. Invoices accounted for rubble removal that never included the tonnage implied by the earlier notes. The pattern did not announce itself. It assembled slowly, page by page, through absences rather than declarations. Amendments appeared in the margins, adjusting routes, shifting abutments downstream, reassigning crews to stretches of riverbank officially untouched. Later projects reused those same banks without recording preliminary clearing. No demolition budgets, no foundation work, only superstructures rising where, according to the paperwork, nothing substantial had stood before. The documents were intact, the record-keeping precise. What they described and what the ground had offered were beginning to drift apart. From bridge ledgers I moved outward into flood mitigation files, the kind of paperwork generated only when water forced officials to shore up riverbanks before damage spread into the city. These reports were practical documents: embankment slopes, sandbag counts, timber bracing, yet buried among them were repeated references to stone already in place. Not rubble, not debris washed downstream, cut blocks. The phrasing was consistent across districts separated by miles. Crews reported striking squared masonry while driving pilings. Inspectors annotated delays caused by hard obstruction, then listed dimensions that exceeded anything required. For temporary retaining work, each time the classification shifted: geological interference, irregular substrate, anomalous bedrock. The language mattered. When structures appear in reports, they receive line drawings, sectional diagrams, cost overruns. These did not. They were absorbed into categories meant for soil and shale, despite being quarried, dressed, fitted. I laid the sites onto 19th century survey maps, depth markers aligned along the same river curve, material descriptions repeated with unsettling precision. Granite in one district, limestone upstream, mortar traces noted, then dismissed. Coincidence thinned into pattern. Bureaucracy has its own gravity. It pulls unfamiliar objects into familiar boxes. The deeper I read, the clearer that gravity became. If these were foundations, they were being recorded as something else entirely. From municipal files I shifted into print, into the public record that was supposed to mirror whatever disturbed the city underground. 19th century newspapers were meticulous about civic works. Bridge openings merited full columns. Drainage upgrades earned diagrams. Even minor street closures generated editorials. The first mention of buried masonry appeared in a provincial weekly, 3 paragraphs deep beside a report on harbor tariffs. A single line about stone uncovered during river works, attributed to unnamed officials, followed by nothing at all. Dublin papers echoed the pattern. Short notices surfaced during flood seasons, unexpected obstruction, hard foundation encountered, then elections arrived. Factory strikes, royal visits. The columns filled with louder events, and the anomalies slipped out of view. What mattered was timing. Follow-up pieces never appeared. No engineering supplements, no clarifying letters from surveyors. The initials at the bottom of those early notes never reoccurred in later coverage of infrastructure. I arranged the clippings by date and overlaid them with contract announcements from city offices. The stories ended precisely as spending accelerated. Print did not dispute what lay beneath the streets. It simply stopped talking about it. To understand whether Dublin's buried stone could be reconciled with contemporary practice, I turned to the manuals engineers relied on in the middle decades of the 19th century. Treatises on bridge construction circulated widely through Britain and Ireland, dense with tables, sectional drawings, and formulas governing load distribution across riverbeds of varying composition. They were cautious documents. Foundation depths were calculated to the inch. Masonry blocks were sized for economy as much as strength. Mortar recipes emphasized speed of cure, resistance to frost, predictable failure modes. Redundancy existed, but only where water velocity or unstable sediment demanded it. None of them described what the Dublin records implied. The footings noted beneath the streets exceeded recommended widths by multiples. Stone courses were listed as layered far below scour lines that the manuals treated as theoretical extremes. Mortar residues, mentioned by inspectors, suggested compositions closer to permanent hydraulic mixes than the temporary binding agents favored during rapid urban expansion. I compiled the comparisons line by line, specification against specification, depth against depth. The manuals did not forbid such construction. They simply never required it. Later bridges, erected decades afterward and credited to different firms, revealed the same oversized substructures when renovations exposed their bases, the same thicknesses, the same redundancies, as though designers had inherited something already in place, as though the textbooks had arrived after the ground had been prepared. Once Dublin's files refused to resolve themselves, I stopped treating the city as an isolated case. Ports generated paperwork with an intensity rivaling any capital. Cargo tonnage, dock extensions, river dredging, bridge reinforcement along shipping corridors that connected Britain and Ireland into a single commercial system. Liverpool's Harbour Board minutes preserved the same careful accounting. Dublin favoured. Glasgow's river authorities produced even more. I searched for foundation references. They were there. Not prominently, not in engineering supplements. They appeared in the margins of dredging budgets and in delay notices filed after winter floods. Stone encountered below expected strata. Piers resting on pre-existing mass. Courses of masonry interrupting sediment layers that surveys had classified as uniform. The depth figures repeated, so did the language. Liverpool's clerks used the same neutral phrasing Dublin's inspectors preferred. Glasgow's harbour engineers recorded block dimensions that exceeded what emergency reinforcement required, then moved on without elaboration. No diagrams followed, no tenders issued for removal, no special appropriations recorded. I began arranging the numbers chronologically. Decades overlapped, the same river improvements, the same unexplained obstacles, the same quiet transitions back to ordinary civic work. When I checked the newspapers tied to those ports, the pattern held. Short notices, no follow-ups, then nothing. The records ended the way Dublin's had. not with answers, with absence. After the newspapers fell quiet, I returned to the council minutes. Municipal proceedings were designed to preserve continuity. Every expenditure debated, every tender approved. Sewer expansions required weeks of discussion, down to the cost of bricks and cartage. Yet in the months surrounding the first excavation entries, the language shifted. Budgets migrated between line items without explanation. Drainage allocations shrank while contingency funds expanded. Contractors were replaced mid-project, recorded only as reassignments for efficiency. The phrasing repeated so often it began to feel mechanical. Dates lined up. A dig suspended along the Liffey, a new engineer appointed 2 weeks later. The following meeting summarized 3 months of work in a single paragraph. Then the pages thinned. Technical appendices disappeared from the bound volumes. Earlier minutes attached diagrams, soil profiles, labor rosters. The replacement reports contained none of that. They offered conclusions without measurements, outcomes without process. Signatures remained. The handwriting changed. When I plotted the substitutions against the stalled excavation sites, the overlap tightened. Not proof, not accusation, simply a sequence that resisted randomness. Administrative systems preserve what they need to function. What they omit is harder to classify. By the end of that year, the council had approved new sewer routes and closed the old accounts. No one recorded what the first crews had reached. Before allowing the records to pull me toward institutional explanations, I turned back to the ground itself. Victorian surveyors left behind detailed geological profiles of the Liffey Basin. Sediment charts tracked clay strata, gravel beds, glacial deposits laid down long before the city existed. River engineers catalogued scour patterns and flood cycles, estimating how currents reshaped banks from season to season. Quarry registries listed what stone was extracted locally and when, down to cart routes and toll fees. If the foundations were natural, they should have fit inside those systems. They did not. Borehole samples taken during later renovation projects encountered material that diverged from surrounding bedrock. Limestone blocks sat within clay layers, mapped as uninterrupted for hundreds of yards. Mortar residues appeared where surveys predicted nothing but compacted silt. Grain orientation in certain stones suggested cutting rather than fracture. I assembled the data conservatively. Geological column beside excavation depth, quarry output beside masonry. Volume. Nature could account for obstacles. It did not account for symmetry, nor for repetition. Subsequent municipal studies noted the discrepancies in careful language, recommending additional cores, restricted work zones, quiet reassessments. Permits slowed. Oversight committees multiplied. Academic reviews referenced the anomalies only in appendices. The rock did not match the river, and the river did not match the records. Whatever lay beneath Dublin resisted classification from both directions. By the time the geological profiles were set beside council minutes and procurement logs, the material no longer behaved like a collection of isolated curiosities. I assembled the record chronologically. Excavations paused in 1862, budgets shifted, contractors changed, newspaper notices thinned, geological anomalies surfaced during later repairs, manuals failed to anticipate what crews encountered. Comparable depths appeared beneath Liverpool docks and Glasgow embankments. Harbour boards documented the same interruptions. Then their files, too, went quiet. No single document asserted an earlier phase of construction. Taken together, they suggested one. The pattern did not require secret coordination to exist. It required only that successive administrations inherit ground conditions they did not create, and paperwork systems designed to normalize whatever could not be easily removed. Infrastructure survives its builders. Archives do not always survive infrastructure. The institutions that threaded through every chapter remained faceless. Committees authorized work, boards approved spending. Offices catalogued delays, each acted within its mandate, recording what was necessary to proceed and leaving the rest unarticulated. I resisted the temptation to move faster than the evidence allowed. Omission is not proof. Absence can arise from fatigue, cost, irrelevance, or ordinary administrative collapse. Yet when absence aligns across departments, decades, and coastlines, dismissal becomes more difficult to maintain. What endured beneath the streets appears to have outlasted not only one generation of engineers, but the memory of why it was placed there at all. Cities inherit more than buildings. They inherit decisions, and sometimes they inherit foundations whose origins no longer appear anywhere on the surface. I returned to the riverbanks, where the record had first fractured. The Liffey moved as it always had, indifferent to 19th century memoranda or modern surveys, flowing past quays that had been rebuilt, reinforced, widened, and resurfaced so many times that their own chronology had become layered rather than linear. Beneath those revisions lay stonework that still refused to resolve into an attributed design phase. What remained was not an answer, but a structure. The cut blocks persisted where silt should have accumulated. Footings extended below depths recommended by Victorian manuals. Mortar compositions diverged from quarry records. Council minutes acknowledged excavation without preserving diagrams. Replacement engineers summarized rather than described. Newspapers redirected attention. Harbor boards filed reports that concluded mid-series. None of these elements demanded a single interpretation. Together, they resisted comfortable closure. I noted where future work might occur, not as speculation, but as obligation. Archival inventories left unopened, engineering boreholes approved but not yet drilled, waterfront redevelopment plans that would eventually require deeper surveys, transit corridors proposed through districts whose subsurface profiles remained schematic rather than confirmed. The record asked for patience. Institutions continued to dominate the narrative. Municipal offices, planning authorities, geological agencies, public works departments. Their documents accumulated slowly, each adding precision while leaving origin unresolved. What unsettled was not the presence of buried stone. It was the absence of a moment in which anyone had claimed responsibility for placing it there. How many other cities inherit foundations they no longer remember authorizing? How often does modern infrastructure depend on frameworks whose designers never entered public record? And how many such systems remain beneath streets, quays, tunnels, and stations, waiting for the next routine project to expose them briefly before paperwork closes again? The ground keeps its history longer than administrations do. That fact does not prove intention. It only ensures that questions persist.